Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. Toto Wolff increasingly under fire after recent comments made at quite some length on the High Performance podcast. Wolff giving his perspective on Lewis Hamilton and exactly the situation on the team over the last couple of years, and suggesting that when Hamilton takes accountability and responsibility for mistakes that he has made or underperformances that he individually has made, it takes pressure off of the team. But it's not like that team has delivered Hamilton a car or upgrades that he can be proud of or really appreciative of over the last couple of years, given the expectations of this team and driver. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always. I greatly appreciate it. It's still a weekend or so away from the Las Vegas Grand Prix getting back underway, but for that Grand Prix, we will have VCARB with a brand new upgrade. Now, it's always somewhat controversial that they can do this, but it's not illegal or anything. I mean, Haas basically buy everything they possibly can from the Ferrari, but it is interesting that VCARB did use alternate rear suspensions and gearboxes. Often what will happen with a sister team in this case, and obviously Haas Ferrari isn't the same arrangement because they're not owned by the same people, which is why Zak Brown gets especially annoyed, and understandably I think, about the fact that, you know, Ricciardo going for fastest lap in Singapore, stuff like that. That doesn't happen with Haas and Ferrari to the same extent. You know, it doesn't happen with Williams and Mercedes, for example. But obviously with the same ownership stuff, it does happen with Red Bull on occasion, which is obviously a point of controversy every 10 or so races. There's some sort of drama with regard to this whole main sister team stuff. But look, they will be using the new RB20 stuff. Usually what will happen here, what I was going to say, is that the teams will use last year's version because at least they know what it looks like. So if you're Racing Bulls, you're designing next year's car, you might want to use last year's Red Bull suspension so that you can design to that spec. Whereas if Red Bull turn up with their brand new spec at the start of the season, how do you design around that? But now it's got to a point in the season where RB will use the new RB20 rear suspension and gearbox, and apparently that's going to give them potentially a tenth of a second. So that car has been reasonably competitive over the last few rounds. They had a very good Brazil, of course, both Tsunoda and Lawson on good pace, certainly in the qualifying session. Whether they can go that much further than that, I guess time will tell. Let's talk Sergio Perez though, because his seat at Red Bull is such a matter for debate. It's honestly incredible how every day there's a new upgrade on this, or new update on this. Whether an upgrade for Checo is possible, I think is factually confirmed. But whether they'll do it is another debate. So what was this? Planet F1 actually, yeah, they come up with a shortlist and they say, in their opinion, they would sign Bottas and Magnussen over Bottas, Perez over those two. But their two favourites are Lawson or Colapinto. Now, I don't know if I'd have Perez that high up this list. To be honest, the reason why Perez is there, we think, is, okay, he's a known quantity, but equally, he's got great partners. And, you know, that does matter to Red Bull, as we full well know. And today, there was a very interesting confirmation that Formula 1 have an official chocolate brand partner. So I think it's actually confirmed to what it's officially called. It's basically the official chocolate partner, official chocolate bar of Formula 1. So Kit Kat by Nestle, it makes sense, and I have a break and all this. You know, I don't hate all the branding and stuff. It's a bit of a strange one. I'm not, you know, if I had to choose a chocolate bar, I wouldn't have chosen Kit Kat to partner with F1, but it is what it is. What you might be aware of, though, is that Nestle and Kit Kat directly sponsor a couple of drivers. I think they sponsor Pato Award maybe as well. So another Mexican driver, of course, racing in IndyCar for McLaren. But they also directly sponsor Perez. And this is another one of those twists in the tail, isn't it? Look, the other day, Christian Horner said, we've got to base our decision on pure performance. And if they base it on pure performance, there's only one outcome. Red Bull are probably going to be third in this year's Constructors' Championship with, on the balance of the entire season, the best car or very nearly the best car. That comes down to almost entirely Perez massively underperforming as soon as the car was nearly fastest or not quite fastest or, you know, second to the McLaren. Perez just fell off a cliff. So on that basis, there's no way he keeps the seat. But we know that he has backing, and this is why people are starting to call him Perez, which is a brilliant slander name in my opinion. But, you know, Sergio Perez, just because he's got the backing from lots of top dogs over in Mexico. We know that Carlos Slim, the father and the son over at Telmex, I think it's called in Mexico, that put big money in. They sponsor Red Bull too, but the rumour was a couple of days ago that actually no, Telmex are going to pull out of sponsoring Red Bull. They're going to maintain their sponsorship of Checo, but obviously, if they're not there to pull the strings with Red Bull Racing, that might change the picture. But according to Massa, there was an interesting update today that Perez has more sponsors on the way. Like, this guy is out of control with the sponsors able to bring to the team, right? So apparently there are new additional sponsors that he's bringing for his own campaign and for potentially the team itself. So supposedly this has been given the go-ahead by Christian Horner to start merchandising with them for next year, which of course does point towards that they're going to potentially keep Perez around on the payroll. So, it's a very fascinating situation right now where Perez is clearly not performing well enough on track. And it's become a point this season where Max cannot win both championships on his own as he was able to last year. But of course, Perez has maintained this entire time that he ain't going anywhere. He said to the press when quizzed on this, like, look, I'll be in Vegas, I'll be here next year, don't know what you're worried about, I'm not going to worry about it, the team has told me I'm safe type thing. Although, of course, Horner's words and Marco's words, Marco's literally said that he expects a rookie or a junior at least in that car for next year, someone other than Perez, was Marco's implication, and he's the senior advisor to Red Bull. You'd think he has a part to play in this. But as we know, Perez is an important factor for Red Bull in other ways than just the actual performance on the track, which hasn't really been there. And that's the big debate right now, because if Perez actually does have more sponsor money back on the way, and we've got KitKat, his sponsor, partnering with F1, there might be some big money movers behind the scenes really wanting Perez to maintain that drive. And if that's true, then, Red Bull's Christian Horner might have a difficult time saying no, even if it might be to our eyes the obvious and the correct decision. But here we go, right? Here's Perez with a couple of KitKats because he's sponsored by them. So it's just like, this guy might not be able to drive a Formula 1 car at this point in his career, especially fast compared to Max, but he does cook up a banging advert, it seems, for KitKat. And, obviously there's been lots of talk about this today, saying that maybe that's going to keep him on the grid for even longer. Let's talk about some upgrades that will be on the way, not necessarily this season, but the next, because going into the new year, 2025 is pretty much all about 2026. Next year's cars will be direct evolutions of this year's cars, and, we are expecting it to be a McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull fight, probably again at the front of the field. We'll discuss Mercedes in a second, whether they have any hope of getting back to where they would like to be. But the reality is that every team next year is going to be focusing on 26. Pretty sure from the 1st of January 2025, as in less than a couple of months now, that's when the teams can officially start working on next year's cars for 2026, that is. And because it's such a massive change in everything, they will be working way harder on 26 than 25. But of course, as we know, the aero testing rules, they still apply regardless. So if you're number one in the championship, your development kind of pathway for 2026 is more compromised. A team at the back has more time. Like, this, I think, is where we are going to see whether this idea of giving the worst teams more testing time, more aero testing rules and more CFD testing, whether that's actually going to work. Because with everyone having like a year to work flat out on the 2026 cars, the teams that have almost double the time as the last place team will compared to McLaren at the front of the field, assuming they win the Constructors' Championship this season, that could be a massive deal when there's nothing to build on from a previous year. So I think it's going to be very telling. And of course, Ferrari will want to win this year's Constructors' Championship, but even if they end up seconds, that might not be the end of the world, because it means that next year they have just a bit more time than McLaren to prepare their 2026 car, which might be relevant, but of course it's going to be more relevant for Red Bull, for Mercedes, and for teams further down the grid. Certainly Aston Martin. I think that's what's quite interesting, and I wouldn't say excites Newey, because obviously the team is in kind of shambles at the moment, but they do have some positive things for Aston Martin on the go. They have a new simulator. Mike Crack says it's like something out of Star Wars. So hopefully it actually works reasonably effectively here, and Newey's going to want to see exactly that. But of course, with Aston Martin further down the order in terms of Constructors' Championship, that does give them more testing time for 26, which could well be, critical in the longer term. But, the idea of Aston making a jump from being mid-pack, if not lower mid-pack, to being the best team in the world in 26, is going to be, as we know, a serious challenge, but it's not one that I'd absolutely put out of the reach of Adrian Newey with his tenure. Let's talk Mercedes, though, because they have 3 more rounds, and the championship for them is done. They can't catch third, they can't fall to 5th. So they are in no man's land in 4th place right now. Who cares about the Drivers' Championship really when you're nowhere near the front anyway? So they're spending the last 3 races basically running experiments. And it's like, have Mercedes learned nothing for the last few years? Like, here we were in 2022, and it was like, oh yeah, Merc are going to run some more experiments. It was the same story in 2023. And apparently, despite all this long-term development, it's going to be the same story here in 2024. What's very interesting about Mercedes right now is that they talk as if their upgrade has actually worked. Because earlier in the season, Silverstone, Spa, of course, they won in Austria. I think in many respects, Austria was like their race pace, right? They were quite substantially behind the Red Bull and the McLaren, but, you know, they weren't slow necessarily, and that was in the period where Ferrari were having a very challenging time indeed. But over the last couple of rounds, and then they won Silverstone, and with the fastest car, they won Spa. Okay, maybe they weren't the fastest car in Silverstone, it was close. Probably McLaren should have won that race, to be honest. Spa, they were the fastest car, and they did win. They had a 1-2 before Russell then got disqualified, of course. But now we're at the end of the season, and Mercedes are basically saying, yeah, our car is kind of a shambles, but the upgrade worked as intended, right? In 2022, the year that was like one of their worst ever years with the W13, they obviously won one race in Brazil, but they brought an upgrade in Austin that year, and it worked. The car was more competitive. It wasn't quite the RB18, but it was more competitive. It was better than the F175 at the end of the season. That was, of course, that year's Ferrari. So the Merc was looking good. There was optimism going into 2023, which never materialized, and but they brought an upgrade to Austin that year that actually worked. This year they brought an upgrade to Austin, which, well, they say it worked, but did it really? I mean, Russell might say that it did. We know that there were slightly different spec cars that Hamilton and Russell were running in Brazil. At least that was the rumor at the time. So, you know, and you're watching Hamilton's onboard, like, clearly there's something wrong with that car. Like, you know, watching his qualifying lap, he did a decent sector 1 and the car just did not want to turn in sector 2, which of course cost him all the time. And yeah, Chauvelin says that the car just doesn't really work in slow corners. This, I think, is actually very damning to Mercedes, though. They brought an upgrade to Austin, and they didn't expect it to solve the problem. So they say, where we tend to be weak is in the slow speeds, particularly the ones where you've got one slow speed into another slow speed. There's lots of turning of the car. That's a weakness we need to work on. We didn't expect the upgrade kit to improve that. So it's like, hang on a second. This is like your major upgrade kit for the season where you're meant to try and solve your number one problem. And you're like, well, you know, yeah, we couldn't solve it or something, right? So what is the implication here? Mercedes have a slow speed corner weakness. They bring their final major upgrade package of the season, and it doesn't even address the weakness? Like, what are you talking about, right? Like, surely that's exactly what it should be addressing. And if they've not done that, then it begs the question, can they even address it? Do they know how to do it? Do they not realize at the time? And they say, yeah, we lifted the base performance of the car. But that doesn't necessarily mean at all that they've really moved the needle massively in the right direction. So, you know, there's no doubt to anyone that Hamilton's happy to be out of there. He's off to Ferrari very shortly, of course. And Fred Vasseur even commented and said, yeah, getting Hamilton to sign wasn't even a challenge. Ferrari's always been on his mind, and the stars definitely aligned at the moment. But the interesting thing is Hamilton is struggled this season, right? There's no doubt about it. And maybe that shouldn't be a massive surprise. Is the motivation going to be there to drive a car which has not improved over the last few years? There's nothing to prove anyway as a driver in Hamilton's position, and he knows he's going to join Ferrari next year regardless. There would be something to prove for Hamilton had he not won a race this year, but because he won Silverstone, which was spectacular, and because he won Spa in somewhat controversial circumstances, but he still won it, it's definitely, you know, shown the world that, okay, Hamilton in the right machinery can still win Grand Prix, and, you know, obviously in terms of the pure numbers, he's not at a good season, but he has at least won a couple of races, which will add to the legacy and whatever. And obviously Hamilton's probably looking back at the season saying, oh, well, at least I won a race, won a couple of races, and it's not a big deal what happens from here on out. And Hamilton has himself admitted that his qualifying pace hasn't been there. He's been roughly 0.1% of Russell's pace this season in quali. Like, it's been super, super tight between the pair of them, as it always has been. But obviously Hamilton has been slightly further behind than he would have been expecting to be. His race pace has still been pretty good, but there's been a few races this season where he's looked relatively lost. But on those weekends, it just usually there's some difference in the car setup between the two teams or between the two sides of the garage. And there's obviously a general feeling that Russell will get the preference there if there is like a theoretical preference of which upgrade or which setup might do better. They'll probably give it to Russell because he's going to be the new number one. That's the theory as it goes anyway. But Hamilton has himself admitted that he can only do so much with the car that he's given, but equally he hasn't been at his best. And he says, look, I've got to be held accountable myself. He knows his qualifying, he's got to work on it, and obviously there's other factors that he's got to work on as well. Just getting to grips with these slow, sluggish cars, it's not really what Hamilton was liked driving and had his success driving. It's not like he isn't adaptable, because he is, but there's certainly characteristics that he would prefer, and those aren't really characteristics that these 2022 and onwards regulations really have. But the drama continues because Toto the other day was talking about it and said, oh, Hamilton gave me no time to react when he told me, as he did. He even talked to Jake Humphries here about exactly how that even happens. And it seems like Toto had mentioned to Lewis when they did their sit-down breakfast meeting, whatever it was, he said to Lewis, oh, hey, like, we're maybe talking about signing some people from Ferrari and all this. And then Lewis kind of remembered. It was like, oh my God, I've got to tell you this, Toto. And then he told him about joining Ferrari. But there was a few interesting comments here. Obviously, we talked about the one a couple of days ago, the one that I would deem sounds pretty disrespectful, which is where Toto said that, well, everyone's got a shelf life, and effectively imply that Hamilton isn't the driver that he used to be. And look, you can debate the merits of that, but to say it of the most successful driver in the sport, apparently a good friend, and a driver that's brought you all of that success, it's not something you'd see Ferrari say about Michael Schumacher, for example, would be my argument. But there was that whole drama that happened, and then it kind of continued. So Toto was talking about that Hamilton after 2021 was in an okay place, and like kind of discussed his perspective on it. And I know that Sim was talking here about, well, an actual close friend of Hamilton, or, well, okay, I'm sure Toto's a friend of Hamilton, because a friend here that he spent Christmas with was talking about how, yeah, he was in a very dark place indeed. So there's some kind of mixed reporting on whether Toto really knows what was going on there or not. But this was the clip that I wanted to share for you guys, where he's talking about the accountability, because Hamilton has taken and said, look, I've not been at my best, and fair enough. But Toto is saying, oh, well, that takes some pressure off the team.
See Lewis coming out and saying, look, I'm not delivering what I know I can. You're almost happy that he's able to get himself to that point and publicly admit that sort of thing.
It takes pressure off the team. You know, he has some devoted fans that will always seek the fault of the team, and he takes pressure off the team. But he's also very honest and transparent about when somebody gets it wrong, either him or the team's performance or anybody else. And I think that means being authentic and credible.
So the implication really being that Toto wants Hamilton to take responsibility and take the blame for many of the situations that have occurred, because, you know, it makes the team feel better, right? The guys back at the factory prefer to be praised, I guess. And I get what he's going for here, but I still feel like the implication is somewhat off, where, you know, Hamilton should be, and obviously this presumably applies to Russell as well in this scenario, but, you know, the theory being that Hamilton, having had some races when he's not necessarily performed as he would have wanted to, and said that to the public, rather than just slamming the guys back at the factory for creating a terrible car. Like, I get it, but equally, if you want to be a top performing team, I guess you've got to balance it both ways. You've got to make sure that the men and women back at the factory designing the upgrade parts and all these other factors, the engineers, they're actually feeling motivated to keep on working and improving. And maybe, you know, some of that works off praise, some of it works on criticism. I guess it depends on the individual. But Toto's argument is that, oh, well, the Lewis Hamilton fans are trying to find blame in the team somehow. And maybe that's not always true and not always fair, but that is how fan bases tend to be. But equally, regardless of what you think about the fan base side of things, it's not like Mercedes have really delivered, have they? Like, they have produced a car for 3 years in a row now, which has been deeply suboptimal and has only been capable of winning a handful of races over the last couple of years. And the upgrades don't even seem to work either. So that's when the debate really kicks in. But very much interested to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.